Hello once again. This is the 8th lecture in the series, How We Got Our Bible. We consider today the New Testament itself. If we look at a copy of the book, perhaps bound nicely and with gilt edges, it seems almost timeless. We might be tempted to think that it came somehow directly from the hand of God. But of course, we know better. At some time in the remote past, living people authored its individual components. Skeptics may tell us that we have no idea who those authors were, and that therefore we can have no confidence that what they wrote is even generally reliable. Well, most of the books bear the names of apostles: Matthew, John, Paul, Peter. So, were they really written by these men? Or are they pseudonymous works, done much later and by people who falsely labeled them as apostolic? These are the two possibilities. Either the books we have were written by some nameless Christians around the end of the first century or into the second, or the apostles and a few select others wrote our 27 New Testament books before the end of their ministry. Oh, I should explain why you're seeing my handsome form on this slide. It's because this topic is a personal one for me. I had been a Christian for almost 70 years before I truly faced up to this question, and only lately have I felt it's resolved. So you're piggybacking on my quest here, and I hope you enjoy the ride. Some may feel that this question is not all that important, but here I will disagree with them. The apostles I can trust. An unknown from a generation later, not so much. Well then, how can we say whether the apostles could have written what we have? Looks like the answer will depend on when these books were written. If they were penned even as late as the end of the first century, then they certainly didn't come from any of the apostles or eyewitnesses. Perhaps we should begin with what liberal scholars typically say about them. Here's a well-known commentary, the Interpreter's Bible. The author of its article on Mark says about that gospel, quote, "To all intents and purposes, we must study the gospel as if it were anonymous, like most of the books of the Bible, not a product of personal literary authorship. The book, Mark, cannot have been written by an eyewitness. It is a compendium of church tradition, not the personal observations of a participant." That author's view is clear enough, isn't it? We could find a similar judgment in this quotation from one of the most respected theologians of the 20th century, Rudolf Bultmann. In fact, he doubts not just Mark, but the entire New Testament. Quote, "I do indeed think that we can now know almost nothing concerning the life and personality of Jesus, since the early Christian sources show no interest in either, are moreover fragmentary and often legendary, and other sources about Jesus do not exist." End quote. This is from Jesus and the Word, Scribner's 1958, page 8. But this kind of skepticism is not just a product of our time. David F. Strauss, a highly regarded philosopher of the 19th century, obviously agrees. Quote, "It would most unquestionably be an argument of decisive weight in favor of the credibility of the biblical history could it indeed be shown that it was written by eyewitnesses, or even by persons nearly contemporaneous with the events narrated. From his massive work, The Life of Jesus, Volume 1, page 88. These views are representative of liberal scholarship, and we can summarize them in 2 bullet points. The New Testament writings were composed late, well beyond the time of the apostles and eyewitnesses, and the authors are essentially anonymous. How far back do you suppose does this attitude extend? Actually, it has been a decay of faith. After a millennium and a half in which most Christians believed in apostolic authorship, we saw skepticism born in the 1600s with the rise of rationalism. Rationalism, the belief that all events can be explained by rational investigation. This view led many to question anything miraculous, and their confidence in the Bible began to fade. One major center of such skepticism developed at a German university in the 1700s, the so-called Tübingen School of Historical Criticism. Its influence on Christian scholarship was corrosive and considerable. Growing out of the notion that the miraculous events in the Gospels cannot be historical, it left students asking, what remained of Jesus' life? And so we saw, in the 1800s and into the 1900s, many who said they were on a quest for the historical Jesus. What was he really like once all the miracles were stripped away? Albert Schweitzer, celebrated as physician, musician, humanitarian, and philosopher, shared that curiosity, and his Quest of the Historical Jesus became recommended reading in many colleges. And it didn't stop there. The study of the Bible as an ordinary human work took the name of higher criticism, and we have heard much of it ever since. In the mid-20th century, its study of the Gospels produced a theory that they were drawn from 2 earlier documents, Ur Mark and Q. The German influence is seen here, since Ur Mark is early Mark in German, and Q is short for Quelle, German for source. But the two-source theory soon fractured into multiple pieces and an approach called form criticism. All this led to a general skepticism about the Gospels in particular. Comments like this have thus become usual. Quote, some businessman or housewife may have made the first records of Jesus' words, along with business or household accounts. Out of such jottings in Aramaic and Greek, some earlier Matthew or Luke may have compiled the sayings of Jesus, which were used in the teaching sections of the first and third Gospels. That's C.C. McCollum from The Earliest Christian Books. The Decay of Faith. After some 1,500 years in which Christians said the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, skepticism about the supernatural started eating into the universities and then the churches, generation after generation. 400 years of the gradual decay of faith, and we come at last to our own time, when liberal scholarship tells us two things. There aren't any inspired New Testament books, How can there be, if one doesn't believe that God gives miraculous inspiration? And there are not even any reliable ones, because what we have was written generations after Jesus lived. The authors just didn't know. But many Christian scholars resisted this erosion of faith. The contrast between the two views, then, has come to look like this. The traditional view has been that Mark was written around the 60s AD and Matthew soon after, Luke perhaps in the 70s, and John a good bit later, around 85 or 90. The higher critics, however, envision a long process of development before the four Gospels finally appear. First, there are people's individual memories of what Jesus said and did. Miracle stories, like the healing of a blind or lame person. Sayings, like, "Render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Then, conflicts with groups like the Pharisees or Sadducees, including colorful phrases like "generation of vipers," and parables like the one of the sower, or occasions when Jesus called a Matthew or a Peter to follow him. All of these, we are told, probably gave rise to informal diary accounts, and then, perhaps, anonymous persons drew on those remembrances to write documents like Urmark and Q. Still later, another anonymous person drew on Urmark to write one of our Gospels and put Mark's name on it. And that document became a source for someone who wrote our Gospel called Matthew. And then another author used material from both Matthew and Q to produce the Gospel he called Luke, with Q being the source of the 9 chapters of so-called new material one finds only in Luke. And finally, much later, someone writes the Gospel we call John, drawing on a scattering of fragmentary memories and traditions about Jesus. And of course it didn't stop there either. In the 1990s, we had the Jesus Seminar, a group of liberal scholars who met periodically to discuss how much of what we find in the Gospels can be considered authentic. They actually used 4 colored balls to vote on each saying of Jesus, red for historical, black for not, and 2 levels in between. They concluded that only about 40% of what's in the Gospels was historical. Now, this slide is about as cluttered as any you may have seen. Let's not lose the key difference between the traditional dating and form criticism's dates. In the traditional view, the Gospels were written early enough to be reasonably accurate, but form criticism only lets them appear much later. A red line at about the end of the 1st century marks the difference. Now, if only we could know when they were actually written. As for me, I certainly didn't buy the radical liberal view, but I was less than sure of what the real story was. And then lightning struck, and from 2 directions. First, I read a book by John Robinson called Redating the New Testament. Robinson was the last person I'd expect to write such a book. Though an Anglican bishop, Robinson was on record as virtually an atheist, and he was a chief spokesman of the Death of God movement back in the 70s. But he retained a fascination with the New Testament and produced a meticulously researched book that argued that all of its 27 books were written before the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70. And other scholars began to adopt similar views. Another stroke of lightning came from a completely different source, a Jesuit monk with the unlikely name of Jose O'Callaghan. He was on the faculty of the prestigious Pontifical Biblical Institute and a specialist in the study of ancient papyri, highly respected in his field. And he announced that he had found fragments of New Testament writings that dated from the mid-1st century. The combined impact of these two revelations on me was stunning. If there really were physical evidence that the New Testament works were produced in the apostles' lifetimes, that would change everything. Now, in fact, I had always assumed that the New Testament works were authentic, but I had done so primarily by relying on the authority of tradition and conservative scholarship. Much of those views seemed to be a combination of informed guesswork and old-fashioned faith. Solid evidence seemed to be lacking. And what did we need? Robinson had a theory of early composition, and O'Callaghan claimed he had proof. Well, Robinson's theory sounded good, but I needed to see O'Callaghan's so-called proof. I wasn't new to the question of early composition. In lectures on apologetics, I had often referred to this papyrus, P52, from the John Rylands collection, containing a few verses from John's Gospel. It's dated early in the 2nd century. I thought that was pretty impressive. But was it the earliest New Testament fragment? Robinson's view of early composition implied that there must have been earlier copies, and O'Callaghan thought he had found them. Most of us know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in a series of caves in 1948. Well, it was in 1955 that another Dead Sea cave was found, Cave 7. It contained just some scraps of papyrus, 18 of them. The finders concluded that the cave had been sealed by AD 68, amid the Roman conquest. These fragments, though, were in Greek, not Aramaic or Hebrew, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and on papyrus rather than parchment. Since they were written only on one side, it was clear that they had been in scroll form, not book form, and that helped to confirm their early date. And Cave 7 was not far from Jericho, a fact that may help explain that its contents were rather different. Different, but important. The writing was in a professional scribal style. Whoever had written these considered them significant enough to be done with care and hidden when war came. Well, the fragments were published in 1962 as part of the Dead Sea collection. Scholars were able to identify only 2 of the scraps. One was from Exodus, and the other from an apocryphal letter of Jeremiah. The others they simply listed as unidentified. These fragments were certainly older than P52 by perhaps 75 years. But what were they? Enter Father O'Callaghan. Studying the unidentified fragments, he became interested in the one you see here. It contained an unusual combination of letters, one that didn't match any Greek word he knew, other than the one meaning begat. But the genealogical parts of the Bible didn't contain any sentences that fit with the other bits of words on the fragment. Then he remembered the place name Gennesaret. Gennesaret also had that unusual combination of letters, N-N-E-S in English. But it was a word that appeared only in the New Testament. When he checked, all the letters on the scrap matched up with the text from Mark 6:52 and 3. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and anchored there. For all the letters in the lines to match up, that scrap must have come from a page like this. Father O'Callaghan published his finding about this passage in 1971, and the media reaction was wild. The New York Times: if Father O'Callaghan's theory is accepted, it would prove that at least one of the Gospels, that of St. Mark, was written only a few years after the death of Jesus. The Chicago Tribune was even more excited. If this theory is accepted by scholars, biblical research would be revolutionized. And this person, who wrote into Time magazine, said what many were thinking. If this is right, quote, they can make a bonfire of 70 tons of indigestible German scholarship, end quote. The conservative scholar F.F. Bruce, though, was cautious. It would be exciting and welcome news indeed if his suggestions would be substantiated, but they must be regarded thus far as being sub judice. And so thought many, that the jury was still out on the subject. Well, I had read about this back in the 70s, and seeing the hesitation of scholars like Bruce, I too decided it was too risky to bet on such a radical claim, and that's where I left it, for then. Now, fast forward 45 years. I came across the detailed evidence for O'Callaghan's claim, which I had not seen before, and then I took a new, hard look. Here's what I found. The dating of the cave and the papyri had been done by the scholar who did the initial publication, C.H. Roberts. He had pointed out that this scribal style was used only from 50 B.C. to A.D. 50, so the mid-1st century was the latest possible dating in the original editor's own judgment. Father O'Callaghan had also accepted all the sure letters, just as they'd been identified in the published record, and he had read almost all of the doubtful letters, as the publisher had as well. So up to that point, he had added next to nothing new, and those who had studied the scrap agreed that it did not match anything from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But there were other considerations, and important ones. The average number of letters per line is important when you're dealing with a few letters from different lines. The term for that is stichometry, and the line length of 20 to 24 letters allows all of these bits to fit the marked passage. Now, although to a non-specialist it seems there's not enough here to identify, papyrologists regularly do identify fragments no larger than this one. When they have parts of 5 lines, as here, it gives them a 2-dimensional matrix of capital letters. and puzzle enthusiasts may begin to see it really is doable, especially if you spent your whole career honing the technique. A familiar example may help. Here's the opening of a favorite poem of mine, set in all capitals, with no word divisions, and with lines about the same length. Can you read it? There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. That's right, Robert Service, The Cremation of Sam McGee. Suppose we had one scrap torn out of that page, shaped like the one O'Callaghan was studying. Now compare it with a poem we all know, Mary Had a Little Lamb. A similar scrap from it would be totally different. In fact, a mathematician ran the numbers on that probability. The odds against finding this exact matrix of letters anywhere else in all of literature are 900 trillion to 1. But that's not all. It turns out that O'Callaghan had more than one scrap of papyrus. He had 18 of the fragments. Here's the page from the original publication. O'Callaghan identified Mark 4:28, Mark 6:48, Mark 6:52 and 3, Mark 12:17, 4 fragments of Mark, and from different copies of that book. Then there were scraps from other portions of the New Testament, Acts 27:38, Romans 5:11 and 12, 1 Timothy 3:16 and 4:1-3, 2 Peter 1:15, and James 1:23-24. Some of these, he said, were so small as to be only probable, but the Mark fragment and the 1 Timothy one were certain, and overall a compelling collection. Some respondents felt Father O'Callaghan was too ready to believe these identifications. But in fact, he was quite cautious. There are 73 certain and uncertain letters in these fragments, and O'Callaghan agreed with the original editors on 65 of them. But he recognized the passages while they had not. And incidentally, O'Callaghan had never shown any special interest in apologetics. He wasn't looking for a bombshell like this. What's more, I found that there was more papyrus out there. We owe this discovery to Charles Huillet. When touring Egypt over a century ago, in 1903, he found some papyrus fragments with portions of Matthew 26, as you see here. He presented them to Magdalen College, his alma mater, and there they sat in a glass case for nearly a century. At first, they were dated to the 4th century A.D. Then, in 1953, they were examined again and judged to be older, late 2nd century. And then, in the 1990s, they caught the attention of Carsten Thiede, another respected papyrologist. Now, you can usually only date manuscripts of literary documents by their letter style, which changes from generation to generation. But non-literary documents, like personal letters or contracts, often include dates. Exhaustive research convinced Thiede that the Matthew scraps, compared to actual dated documents, came from the 1st century, specifically A.D. 66. When O'Callaghan's evidence is combined with Thiede's, some stunning conclusions emerge. Let's summarize them. Here's a familiar timeline of the first century. Jesus' death and resurrection dates, I believe, to AD 33. James, the Lord's brother, is martyred by decision of the Sanhedrin in 62. The fire in Rome 2 years later leads, as we all know, to Nero's persecution of the Christians, and the believers in Jerusalem, obeying Jesus' instructions to leave the city when it was imperiled, fled to Pella about 68 or 69, escaping the destruction of the city in 70. Now, the evidence of these early papyri and how early they are. Thede dated the Matthew papyrus to AD 66. O'Callaghan dated the two fragments he considered certain even earlier, to the 50s. The evidence for these dates is, in my view, very solid, and if it is, then the common scholarly consensus is already in trouble. Even conservatives would date Mark to the 60s and Matthew the 70s. Liberals would prefer even later dates. But it gets better. Liberals speculate, as you recall, that in the mid-first century there were only a few casual notes. People had taken a few sayings of Jesus, like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," or "Render to Caesar what's Caesar's." But the Mark and Matthew fragments are not of just sayings. They are narrative, from Jesus accompanying the disciples by sea to Gennesaret, and from his anointing at the house of Simon the leper, and from Judas bargaining with the priests to betray his master. In fact, they are almost surely portions of the Mark and Matthew we possess today. And it gets better still, because both of these papyrus fragments come from documents written in a professional scribal hand, not what we'd expect from Matthew or Mark themselves. In other words, they are clearly copies, and so the original documents were even earlier. How much earlier? We can't say, but almost certainly before the 50s, and so within 10 or 15 years after Jesus' ascension. No time, then, for legends to develop. And these fragments tell us more. They're examples of a change from scroll to book form. The O'Callaghan papyri are from scrolls. We know because they were written only on one side, remember? The Matthew papyrus, though, is from a codex written on both sides of the page. Now, it's well known that scrolls were universally used in Roman times, and scholars now agree that the codex was invented by the Christians and used almost exclusively at first for biblical works. Notice the codex was not used for Christian writings generally, but just for works that we find in the New Testament. And these papyrus fragments show us that the codex came into use around AD 60. That's a fact. We have the physical documents as examples of it. Now, hold that thought for a moment while we note another development from this time: the way divine names are written. Those papyrus fragments from the 50s show the divine names like Jesus Christ, Lord God, and so forth, spelled out in full. But the Matthew papyrus, from a decade or so later, abbreviates them in a manner that became standard in manuscripts for the next 1,000 years. For Jesus, the first and last letters, JS. For Lord, that's Kyrios, KS, and so on. Why the change? If you remember, the name of God in Hebrew, Yahweh, was not pronounced by Orthodox Jews. They substituted another, Adonai. It seems that the Christians, very early in their history, instituted a similar practice for divine names, abbreviating them as what scholars call nomina sacra, sacred names. And about the time when they switched from scroll to codex, they began a special treatment of these names. Why just then? Professor Karsten Thiede has, I think, shown us why. Remember that the first believers were all Jewish. Only later did God send Peter to the family of Cornelius and Paul to be apostle to the Gentiles. Early on, Acts tells us that even a great number of priests accepted Jesus as Messiah. And though there was persecution, the Jewish believers lived as much as they could under the umbrella of Judaism, still worshiping at the temple and in the synagogues in hope of continuing to convert their brethren. But then, in AD 62, the Jews lost patience with this sect of the Nazarenes. The Sanhedrin sought out James, the most prominent leader of the faith in Jerusalem, and killed him. And when Nero burned Rome 2 years later, he blamed the Christians, not the Jews. They alone were persecuted. The believers must have realized then that a final split with Judaism was inevitable. And how did they show it? Well, before 62, their sacred writings showed the divine names spelled out like ordinary names. Kurios there, even applied to Jesus, would just strike a traditional Jew as meaning a lord or a master, and not be obviously offensive. But after 62, when there seemed to be no more hope of agreeing to disagree with traditional Jewry, they began to write these names in a way that would be at once seen as divine. Kurios, abbreviated and standing out in this way, would evoke the memory of the divine name in Old Testament scripture. Now, KS would not be just a master, but the Lord of heaven, the Son of God. Just a few scraps of papyrus, but how much they have to tell us. They upend the traditional late dating of the New Testament writings, and even give us a snapshot of the believer's final break with Judaism, just before God ends the sacrificial system forever. And there may be even more to this story, as scholars begin to call for a restudy of the late dating of more of those New Testament papyri. There are about 100, after all. The trickle of evidence may yet become a flood. But we have enough to draw a conclusion here. An avowed near-atheist had done his research and concluded that the New Testament books were all composed before AD 70. A Jesuit papyrologist with impeccable credentials then found 9 fragments coming from 6 different New Testament books, all dated to the mid-1st century. Then a German papyrologist and devout Anglican rescues scraps of Matthew's Gospel from a glass case at Oxford and shows that they also come from the 1st century. 3 men from the most disparate backgrounds, but offering the same conclusion. Just think. After years of hearing that our oldest manuscripts come from centuries after the days of Jesus, suddenly we can point to fragments of papyrus that were written by people who in all likelihood had actually seen the Lord in the flesh. In my view, the evidence is compelling and the choice is clear. The apostles and a few select others wrote our 27 New Testament books before the end of their ministry. And there is a winner here: the church. If you have questions or comments about this lecture, or any others in the Good Answers series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.